Hello and welcome to my presentation on domestic homicide. Today I will be discussing framework number 2, which is the prevalence and economic, social and health costs of domestic homicide, as well as the cultural and systemic practices and community and cultural attitudes and norms which impact on domestic homicide. So first of all, the economic costs from domestic homicide. Both the victims and the government suffer extensive economic loss due to domestic violence and homicide. A study by Distaff Associates found that the total cost of domestic violence annually was $1.5 billion. The women suffer the most from this economic burden, paying at least $800 million per year, with that figure being conservative due to the restrictions of the research grounds, as many women are silent victims and are unable to participate in these studies. In terms of domestic homicide, there are less studies about the impact on economics. However, it is still considered a major public health issue and results in extremely high costs on both governments and victims' families in counselling, legal expenses, and medicine. Here we've got a government graph which shows that the main reason for seeking assistance by women with children, almost half of the percentage is domestic or family violence. And here I've made a little graph about how the difference between women's and government's costs and how it can be really wide-ranging. You don't even think about how much it would cost to deal with domestic homicides or violence. But women, as I said, pay about $800 billion annually, but that is conservative. It could be a lot more because so many women are unable to participate in any studies. So women's costs include medical help and medicine, counselling, legal costs, lost pay, as in they can't go to work if they're sick, or not sick but if they're injured, accommodation and childcare. And the government's costs are about half the amount of women, about $400 million annually, and the New South Wales government spends about $70 million annually. And that includes income support, housing support, child care services, legal costs, medical costs, and support programs. So here we have a visual which is showing the impacts of silent victims, and it's really just to show that there are so many women that are unable to tell their story because they are either silent, they can't go forward and say I'm being abused, or they've already unfortunately been killed. They've been murdered because it's domestic homicide. So there's a lot of women who we don't know what happened and how much they paid or what they did before their murder. Here we've got the social costs of domestic homicide. So the following slides are examples of how prevalent of a social issue domestic homicide is today. Domestic homicide is one of the leading causes of death among women. It has a major social cost for women who are either looking to be or are already in domestic relationships with men. Women are socially conditioned to feel inferior to men, and men are led to believe that they are superior to women. This creates a culture which provides space for domestic violence and homicide at epidemic levels. The social costs of consistently hearing and seeing women being murdered by their partners are that women fear men. Many do not trust them, and often when they eventually do trust them, they break their trust in violent ways. Here we have some of the language used in these articles. It's just interesting to note that so many newspaper articles use divisive language like woman and man. It's creating people as opposites, and it makes a social divide, a divide that often ends in violence. Lisa argues that the only way to stop gender-related harm, like domestic homicide, is to create an environment where men and women can work together to heal this collective wound of our conditioning. So here we've just got some articles that I found, and they're all from 2020. So they were all very recent. And police looking for a husband after Samir Hafiz allegedly beaten to death in a Wentworthville home. This was the only one I found in all of the top articles by top newspapers that named the woman, that had the woman's name. I'm not sure why that is, but it's the only one that had her name. Then we have brother arrested after body of woman 20 found in Sydney's West. Sydney woman found dead in Wentworthville. Police seek man known to her. Western Sydney woman allegedly fatally stabbed by husband in suspected domestic violence attack. Man faces murder charge after woman's body found in Como in Sydney South. And woman 18 found dead at home in Maitland, New South Wales, with a man charged. Now we're going to talk about the health consequences, or the health costs, from domestic homicide. So domestic homicide affects both the victim and the victim's families for years after the murder has taken place, often resulting in PTSD, behavioural problems, psychological problems, and issues in daily life activities for years after the incident. The health impacts also include hospitalisations and use of emergency services. The Australian Institute of Health and Welfare found that 3 out of 20 hospitalisations were due to a domestic violence incident, which means that a large part of the health system is trying to help people who have either already been murdered or are already murdered, or are almost murdered. So here we have a government graph, which is the proportion of domestic homicide victims by type of homicide, by sex of victim. And here you can obviously see that a huge, almost 75% of the victims of women's homicides is by intimate partner homicides. Now we're going to talk about the cultural, systemic and community practice, attitudes and norms which impact on domestic homicide. So cultural and community attitudes and norms can affect the system provided to protect people from crimes like domestic homicide. For example, the misuse of language in judicial proceedings about domestic homicide is a problem identified by Buxton, Namsnick and Bala. They exemplified how certain uses of language when discussing domestic homicide cases can place blame on the victim and give the perpetrator an excuse for their crime, which further alienates women who are currently in a domestically violent relationship and feel that they will not be listened to if they seek help. For example, Buxton, Namsnick and Butler used the example of domestic homicide where a judge infantilized the victim, indicating that she may have been too young or inexperienced to appreciate the danger posed to her by her abusive partner, and suggesting that perhaps if she had known better, she would have ended that relationship prior to her death. Not only is this language hugely damaging to the victim, but it puts the blame onto the victim for not leaving sooner, instead of the perpetrator who actually killed her. This is just one of the many examples of how ingrained cultural and systemic attitudes and norms are continued throughout society, leading to the continuation of problems like domestic homicide. So here I've made a little circular graph which explains, I know that this is not the only cultural, systemic, community practice, attitude or norm which impacts on domestic homicide, but I thought that it was a good example because it shows that even something small like the misuse of language, it can sustain a culture which excuses domestic homicide, and it can sustain people continuing on this crime. There are many other examples, of course, that we couldn't get into in this short of time frame, but I'll just explain what I mean now in how this particular case is so, you can tell exactly what's happened here in terms of continuing on a bad crime. So the judge blames the victim. We don't know why the judge has blamed the victim. It could be something that they are, a personal prejudice. It could be how they learnt about domestic homicides in university. It could be their upbringing. We don't know, but it doesn't exactly matter how much. It matters why they think that way, but what matters is that they sustained that judgment and they brought it onto this case, which means that the judge blames the victim, which in turn means that the perpetrator feels justified or excused. And so the perpetrator may think, well, yeah, I killed her, but she didn't leave, so it's not entirely my fault. And that may mean that other people who are, domestically violent or tend to have violent aggressions towards their partner, they may feel that they're justified because they think, well, if I was doing something wrong, then she'd leave, without really understanding the problems which come with women leaving domestically violent relationships. One of which being that most women who are killed in a domestic homicide case have been killed when they try to leave their domestically violent partner. So many people don't understand, well, if she leaves, she may be killed when she leaves. So it is a difficult situation. So then the victim feels blamed. Of course, the victim in this case was unfortunately passed away, but there are maybe other victims who see the case on TV or hear about it in a newspaper and they think, well, that judge said that it was her fault, so I can't go and ask anybody for help because then they'll just think, well, it's her fault, it's my fault. So the victim feels blamed, and of course other women feel that they shouldn't seek help, and then more domestic homicides happen. And here I have the quote, because it really does just exemplify the problem, that it comes down to, in this case, misogyny. She was too young and inexperienced. She should have known better. It's just a great example of how ingrained one prejudice can be, which can have a butterfly effect in somebody being murdered in their own home. And now we have the last slide. So domestic homicide, it's a problem of epidemic proportions. It's a global problem. It happens in every single country, all over the world. It is not a singular problem. It is not a problem of one culture. It's a problem of all cultures. Everybody has this problem, and it's of epidemic proportions. That's according to the World Health Organization. And as seen from this presentation, hopefully, it impacts on every factor of society. It impacts economics, it impacts our health and social problems and language and prejudices and the patriarchy. It impacts every factor of society, and so it needs every person who is in that society to combat it. It needs everybody, even if somebody hasn't been touched by domestic homicide or severe domestic violence themselves. They may know somebody who has, and they may think, well, I'm not domestically violent, I'm not going to kill my partner, I don't need to do anything about domestic homicide. But maybe that judge had never done anything like that. I would hope that they would never have done anything like that, but their impact, they had an impact on that case, but because of their prejudices. So it really does come down to every person being anti-domestic homicide in order to discontinue this murder of innocent people. And that's the end of my presentation. So I hope that this has been a good presentation and that you've learned a lot, and I'm going to pass it on to framework number 3. Thank you very much.